By late morning on August 27, 1776, about 400 American soldiers had a problem. There were roughly 2,000 British and Hessian troops around them. A marsh was behind them. The main American army was trying to escape on the other side. And sitting directly in front of them was a stone farmhouse filled with British soldiers. There was no good way out. So their commander, Lord Stirling, gave an order that sounds almost insane. They turned toward the British and charged. The first attack was thrown back. The Americans regrouped. Then they charged again. And then again. They were not trying to capture the house. They were not trying to defeat 2,000 men. They were trying to do something much simpler: keep the British looking at them. Because every minute those 400 men remained alive was another minute George Washington's army had to get away. And 7 weeks after declaring independence, the American Revolution had reached the point where a few hundred exhausted soldiers might be all that stood between George Washington and the destruction of his army. 7 weeks earlier, the situation had looked very different. On July 4th, the Continental Congress declared that the 13 colonies were independent. There was just one problem. Britain had not agreed, and Britain was about to send an answer to New York. Not a letter, an army. Through July and August, British warships filled the waters around New York. Transport after transport arrived, carrying infantry, artillery, cavalry, and thousands of German troops hired by Britain. By late August, General William Howe had one of the largest military forces Britain had ever sent outside Europe. Around 32,000 British and Hessian regulars had gathered for the campaign. Washington had more than 20,000 men of his own. But those numbers hid an uncomfortable truth. Many of Washington's soldiers were militia. Many had little battlefield experience. Some had never fought together before. Howe's men were professionals, and New York was exactly the kind of place where Britain could use them. Washington knew New York mattered. Whoever controlled the city controlled one of the best ports in North America and the mouth of the Hudson River. Lose it, and Britain could potentially split New England from the rest of the rebellion. So Washington tried to defend almost everything: Manhattan, Brooklyn, the river crossings, the approaches to the city. And that created the first problem. The British did not have to attack everywhere. Washington had to defend everywhere. He divided his army between Manhattan and Long Island. Then, on August 22nd, British troops began landing on Long Island. Thousands came ashore. Washington still did not know whether this was the main attack or another attempt to pull him away from Manhattan, so he did not commit everything. That hesitation was exactly what William Howe needed. The American position on Long Island was protected by a line of wooded heights. There were only a handful of practical routes through them. Guard those routes, and the British would have to attack through difficult ground. At least that was the idea. On the American right was General William Alexander, better known as Lord Stirling. Under him were troops from Delaware and the 1st Maryland Regiment. The Marylanders were among the better-equipped soldiers Washington had. Many actually carried bayonets, something still uncommon in parts of the Continental Army. And on the morning of August 27th, they seemed to be doing their job. British troops appeared in front of Stirling. The Americans formed. The fighting began. And for hours, Stirling's men held them. From where they stood, this looked like the battle. It wasn't. The real British attack was already behind them. The night before, thousands of British soldiers under Generals Clinton and Cornwallis had started moving. Quietly. They marched east and then north toward Jamaica Pass, one of the routes through the heights. The Americans had barely defended it. By morning, the British column had passed through. And while Stirling's men were facing British troops in front of them, thousands more were moving around the American flank. At roughly 9 in the morning, they struck. Suddenly, American units that thought they were facing the enemy from one direction began receiving fire from another. The entire defensive line started collapsing. Men ran. Units became separated. Officers lost track of their soldiers. Some Americans tried to fight their way back toward Brooklyn Heights. Others surrendered. And on Stirling's part of the battlefield, the situation was about to become much worse. Because his men now realized the British they had been fighting in front of them were not the main problem. The British were behind them too. There was only one obvious way back toward the American defenses: Gowanus Creek. Calling it a creek makes it sound easier than it was. The area was filled with marsh, deep mud, tidal water, and narrow channels. Men trying to cross could lose their footing, weapons became wet, wounded soldiers could drown, and the British were closing in. Stirling understood what was happening. If everybody stayed together, everybody might be captured. So he made a decision. Most of his remaining troops would try to cross the Gowanus Marsh and reach Brooklyn Heights. But somebody had to keep the British from simply following them. Stirling stayed behind. With him were roughly 400 exhausted Maryland and Delaware soldiers. And now the numbers became absurd. Around 2,000 British infantry and Hessians were closing around them. Many British soldiers had taken positions around a building known as the Old Stone House. Through the smoke, the building must have looked less like a farmhouse and more like a fortress. The Americans were surrounded. Their escape route was disappearing. And Stirling's next move was not to retreat, it was to attack. The Marylanders fixed bayonets, then they went forward, straight toward the Old Stone House. British muskets opened fire. Survivors later described volleys so heavy that the musket balls seemed to come at them in sheets. The first charge broke. Men went down. The survivors pulled back. And this should have been the end. They had already done more than anyone could reasonably expect. They were outnumbered roughly 5-1. They were tired. They were surrounded. And the British position was still there. Then the Marylanders formed again and charged a second time. More musket fire. More men fell. They pulled back again. And then they went forward again. At this point, what they were doing only makes sense if you stop thinking of it as an attempt to win. Look behind them. Across the marsh, American soldiers were still trying to escape. Men were wading through mud and water. Units were struggling toward Brooklyn Heights. Every British soldier dealing with Stirling was a British soldier who was not chasing those men. Every volley fired at the Marylanders was a volley not fired at the retreat. Every minute mattered. So the 400 kept attacking. The Old Stone House became the center of a fight they had almost no chance of surviving. And the strange thing is, it worked. The fighting around the house continued for almost an hour. That was enough. Large numbers of Americans escaped across Gowanus Creek and reached the stronger defenses at Brooklyn Heights. By the time the British finally overwhelmed Stirling's rear guard, the price paid by those 400 men was horrifying. 256 Marylanders and Delawareans lay dead around the battlefield. More than 100 were captured. Many of those prisoners would later die in captivity. Only a few dozen of the men who made the stand escaped back to American lines. Lord Stirling did not make it back either. But even his surrender was unusual. Surrounded by British troops, he refused to give himself up to them. Instead, he managed to reach a group of Hessians and surrendered to them. Tactically, the Battle of Brooklyn was a disaster for Washington. There is no clever way around that. The Americans had been outmaneuvered. Their defensive line had collapsed. Hundreds were dead or wounded. Hundreds more had been captured. And Washington's remaining army was now packed into the defenses of Brooklyn Heights, with the East River behind it. The British had won, and somehow, the danger was getting worse, because Howe now had the Americans exactly where he wanted them. Washington's army was concentrated against the river. British troops were in front of them. The Royal Navy was nearby. If British ships moved into the East River and cut the route to Manhattan, Washington might lose more than a battle. He might lose the army. This is why the Marylanders' stand mattered. They did not turn Brooklyn into an American victory. Nothing could do that. They did something more useful. They prevented defeat from immediately becoming destruction. Their stand near the Old Stone House helped give American survivors time to reach Brooklyn Heights, and NPS notes that the fighting halted the British offensive for the day, an interruption that may have prevented Washington and his army from being captured. And Washington needed every bit of that time. For the next 2 days, the Americans remained trapped in Brooklyn. Then Washington made his decision. The army would leave. Not tomorrow morning, not in stages over several days, that night. Thousands of men had to cross the East River from Brooklyn to Manhattan. Quietly, without the British realizing what was happening. Artillery had to be moved. Horses had to be loaded. Soldiers had to disappear from the lines without creating panic. And if the British discovered the evacuation halfway through, the troops still waiting on the Brooklyn shore could be trapped. The evacuation continued through the night. Then nature gave Washington one final gift: fog. A heavy fog settled across the area and helped conceal the final stages of the withdrawal. British troops remained unaware that the army in front of them was disappearing. Boat after boat crossed the river. Men who had survived the battle climbed aboard. Then more. Then more. By morning, Washington's army was gone. The British had won one of the largest battles of the Revolution. They had broken the American defenses. They had killed, wounded, or captured well over 1,000 men. And still, they had failed to destroy George Washington's army. That distinction would matter enormously, because Washington was about to lose again. The British drove him from New York. Fort Washington fell. Fort Lee was abandoned. The Continental Army retreated across New Jersey. By December, Washington had only a few thousand men left with him behind the Delaware River. On paper, the revolution looked close to finished. But Washington still had an army, and as long as that army existed, the war could continue. 4 months after Brooklyn, Washington crossed the Delaware and attacked Trenton. A week later came Princeton. The army that Britain had almost trapped on Long Island was suddenly winning again. That does not mean 400 Marylanders single-handedly caused Trenton. History does not work that neatly, but there is a much simpler connection. You cannot cross the Delaware with an army that no longer exists. You cannot attack Trenton with soldiers who were captured in Brooklyn. You cannot keep a revolution alive if its commander and its main field army disappear 7 weeks after independence is declared. At Brooklyn, Britain had a chance to turn an American defeat into something much larger. Those 400 men helped make sure that did not happen. Maryland would later become known as the Old Line State, a name traditionally associated with the reputation its soldiers earned during the Revolution. But the men remembered as the Maryland 400 were not all Marylanders. Delaware troops fought beside them, and even the number 400 is an approximation. History cleaned the name up later. The battlefield itself was much messier. What matters is what those men did. They found themselves surrounded by roughly 2,000 professional soldiers. Their friends were trying to escape behind them, and instead of following, they turned around. They charged once, they were driven back. They charged again, and when that failed, they went again. Not because they believed 400 men were about to defeat the British Army, but because somewhere behind them, other Americans were still moving toward safety. The first major battle fought after the Declaration of Independence ended in a British victory. Washington lost the field. He lost men. He lost New York soon afterward. But there was one thing the British did not take from him that morning: his army. And that may have been the only thing that mattered. Because the Maryland 400 did not need to win the Battle of Brooklyn. They only needed to keep fighting long enough for George Washington to lose it and survive.